Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Just as you shut the doors, more people come in. Always, as soon as you get started, there'll be the last few people trickle in. There are seats in the front. We'd love to see some more people sitting in the front half of the room. Welcome, everybody, to my talk while people trickle in. I'll get started anyway. For those of you who haven't worked it out, hi, my name's Amy. I have travelled all the way from Australia to join you here this week. Despite having done this a few times, it still feels super weird that I literally have one flight to get here. I get on one plane and then I land in London, which feels so weird to me. But it is really nice to be back here in London. I've been here for quite a few NDC Londons, and it always is a little bit near and dear to my heart, despite the fact that apparently the weather does get nicer than it is in January. January seems to be my favourite time to visit the UK. So I'm very excited to be here with you all today. As I said, my name's Amy. I am a front-end developer. I work with companies to help them build websites, to build the front end of their applications. And am very passionate about a whole lot of front end things, including front end testing. So today we're going to talk about front end testing, in particular with GitHub Actions. First of all, I'm not going to delve really deeply into why we need to test. I'm going to assume that given the fact that you're all here, you understand that we do need to test the front end of our applications, that it's important. So whether or not you're here or watching it from home, I'm assuming you've already understood that testing is important. If you don't know or aren't quite convinced yet, I've got another talk that I gave a few years ago on why you need to test the front end of your applications and delving a bit more in depth into the writing and the how tests. I did give it in London in 2020, but this link is to my talk which I gave in Sydney later on in the year, so it's a little bit more up to date. TLDR, when you test the front end of your website, you kind of need a front end. You need a live website to go through and test. Unlike running other tests, like unit tests, where you can give it dummy data and make sure that the output is what you expect it to be. For front-end tests, you need to have a functioning front end to test against. And for front-end tests like performance testing, it's really important that that is as close to your production environment as possible. For example, from this code snippet, can anybody tell me if the user interface is accessible to anybody using a vision impairment? No? Can you tell me how long it's going to take for the page to load, or if any of the resources are going to block page loading? Looking at this CSS code snippet, can you determine if any of the code changes are going to bleed out to somewhere that we don't expect it? Is this only going to change styles of the things we want? Front-end testing needs a front end. While we can perform some linting and validation against the code that we've written, there's only so much that we can work out without seeing the final product. Ideally, as I said, with a setup as close to production as possible so that we can make sure that this is actually what's going to happen when we build it out. So why GitHub Actions, I hear you ask? It's a really great question that I want to answer in two parts. First of all, while better than nothing, manual tests aren't great because it's hard to ensure that they're being run. How many of you enjoy doing repetitive tasks that can be easily automated? If anyone raised their hands, I was going to call them a liar. None of you. It's one of our favourite things to do with AI. We can get rid of the repetitive tasks that we don't like doing. And so when our tests are automated, as part of any kind of process, it means that they're actually going to happen. It adds a check to make sure that we are actually running our tests. And when a pipeline is set up properly, we can ensure that code doesn't pass through, that doesn't pass tests, and it doesn't accidentally get merged in, and we can protect the quality of our application. But why did I choose GitHub Actions for this? Why did I choose GitHub Actions for running tests and as a CI/CD tool? For the most part, it was the fact that the documentation and the assistance available to me made it really easy. It meant it wasn't hard for me to get started. It was also compatible with a lot of existing things and tools that I wanted to be able to use, and had great extensibility. So it works for smaller projects or bigger enterprise projects as well. While the code and conventions that I'm going to go through in this session today is specific to GitHub Actions, the concepts and practices are ones that you can take and reuse with your own tools and processes. For those that aren't familiar or haven't heard of GitHub Actions, I'm going to assume aren't many of you, as it's literally the title of my talk. It's a very powerful tool that you can do a whole lot on. If you want to look into it a bit more, I would recommend checking out the GitHub documentation or otherwise flagging down any of the people from GitHub that are at the conference today. GitHub Actions runs what are called workflows, which are written inside workflow files inside a particular folder of your project, .github/workflows. As with a lot of DevOps tools, these files are written in YAML. Yay, we love working with YAML. Each workflow or action is made up of one or more jobs. By default, these jobs will all run at the same time. And each job is then made up of one or more steps, which will run one after another. So to get started, our workflow file, we have a name of our workflow. This is a people-friendly label for us to know which workflow we're running. For example, here, mine is build and test because we're going to go through and build and test our application. Next, we have a look at how our workflow is triggered. In this case, we want our workflow to run every time a pull request to the production branch gets opened, reopened, or the code gets updated. There are many different options of events that can trigger a workflow. These are just a few of the common ones. We can have triggers around creating, deleting, and updating all sorts of things on our repository, tags, forks, issues, pull requests, you name it, it can probably be integrated with GitHub Actions. Each of these then has more specific settings. For example, the pull request trigger allows us to define the different types of events that trigger the workflow, whether all events or just ones that involve the code being changed. For example, you can just trigger a workflow based on whether or not a pull request is assigned or unassigned, whether or not you've got any reviews requested or removed, whether or not you've turned on or off auto merge. We can also filter this for specific branches. For example, this might just be for production branch, for development branch, or using a wildcard for a feature branch. We can also then filter this down to specific paths. For example, maybe you want to run some JavaScript linting or some TypeScript type checking, but only if specific files like JavaScript or TypeScript files have been changed. We can be really specific and only run the actions that we need to when we need them. But in this case, we want to keep things relatively simple. We want to trigger this when a pull request is submitted. In particular, when a pull request is opened, reopened, or synchronized, which means anytime the code in the pull request is changed. We also only want to run this when the pull request is being opened to the production branch of our repo. So we don't care about the code that exists on other branches just yet. Next, in our workflow file, we want to go through and define some jobs. The jobs are specific tasks that the workflow will complete. By default, these will all run at the same time. Each job gets a unique name, in this case, build, but the name must be unique for every workflow file. We then go through and set the platform that the job will run on. You can choose from a number of different options, but running on Linux is the cheapest option and therefore generally the one we're going to end up doing. Each job then has a number of steps to complete. These will complete one after another. Most of the time, your first step is going to be to check out the code from your repo. Otherwise, you don't really have anything to work with. In terms of the steps are also made up of a name. This is optional and is for us to identify which step is being run. We can also give a step a unique ID. This is optional and we can use that to refer to the step elsewhere inside of our workflow. We can define what the step is actually doing in two different ways. One of them is using users. This allows us to define a specific package that we're going to go through and run. For example, there's a package for setting up Node, which will set up the version of Node that we're using. There's a package to check out the repository code, and there's a whole bunch of third-party packages that we have access to using as well. Alternatively, we can use run to run a command inside of the GitHub Actions terminal. And we can go through and run whatever command we like using whatever we've installed in there. Some steps, we can also add checks to check whether or not a specific condition is met before we're running them. For example, we can check if our workflow has failed, we can do a thing. So in this case, if a workflow has failed, we could add a comment to the PR to go, this has failed, or send a notification to Slack or Teams or post on a social media platform. We can do whatever we want with that. Each of our steps, we can then add some additional information. For example, we probably want to add environment variables to some. On here, we can add environment variables plain text, but most of the time we're probably going to be working with secret values, so we can load in some secret values from GitHub. Alternatively, we can pass in some extra information using the with property. This is specific to a lot of the packages we use. For example, the setup node package, you tell it what version of node you're wanting to use. GitHub script package, you give it the script that you're wanting to use. So, having a look at the steps that we've got so far, we've just got 3 steps to get started. We have, first off, check out the repo code, then set up node, and then install node modules. So each of these have names, so we can easily identify them. The first 2 are using an existing package. We're using the checkout package and then the setup node package. And installing node modules, we can just go through and run npm install. We also need to make sure that the setup node step, we're telling it what version of node we want to use. Once we've got the workflow set up, we can then go to the Actions tab in our repo, and any workflows that we have set up will be there. Now, if we open a PR to merge code into our production branch, it will trigger the workflow to run, which we can see clearly would run at this speed. I have sped it up a little bit because we don't really want to sit here and just watch the pipeline go every time. So once it's run, we can then see in our PR, it will let us know that all checks have passed. Next, we want to go through and actually build our website though. Now, in this case, I have my website. My website is hosted on Netlify, which is mostly free website hosting, very good front-end functionality. I'm going to host it on here for now because most of the time we want our preview application to actually exist where we've got the production one. Netlify has a really useful feature as well, so I know that I can go through and set up a preview which we can access later on. Now this step will be different depending on where it is that you're hosting your website. There are a lot of packages out there for the various different hosts, your Azure and your AWS and your DigitalOcean and all of your other options. So, unfortunately, none of the Netlify packages worked for me. However, I'm a developer, which means I'm going to build one better because we love to build our own things. Thankfully, Netlify has a CLI tool that I can use. So I've created a bash script and saved it in my project. Now, this script, thankfully, wasn't too complicated to get started with. Using the CLI tool, I let it know that I want to deploy my site. I want it to build it first, and then I passed in the site ID and my authentication token. Like a lot of CLI tools, that will then output the results of this function, and I let it know that I want those results to be in JSON format. When I run my command, I want to take that output and save it, and then I'm going to go through and have a look. And one specific part of the output is it will actually tell me the live URL of the website that it's building. So I want to save that to use that later. And I'm going to save that in GitHub output, which will then save it as a variable that I can use in the rest of the steps. Next, we're going to set up the step to go through and run the custom script. This one, I'm going to make sure it has an ID because I want to be able to refer to it later on. And so I'm going to give it the ID of build site. Also want to pass in my environment variables for the authentication token and the site ID. And lastly, I'm going to go through and run the script file that I have in my repo. Also want to make sure I go through and add those secret keys to GitHub so that it works. We can add the secrets to settings, secrets and variables, actions, and go through and add any secrets there. Once that's done, if I submit another PR to production, I can watch the action run and I can then check. It will tell me that all checks have passed, and I can log into Netlify and have a look at what the URL is. However, we did save the URL to use later. So once the site has built, we can then go through and use the GitHub scripts action package to go through and create a comment on our PR that lets us know what the deploy URL is so that we can look at it ourselves. To do this, we want to make sure that we're, again, referring to the build site, the ID for the build site step. We can then pass in that information. So we refer to steps, build site, outputs, which is the output we saved, and then get the Netlify URL from there. We can set that to the body of the pull request comment. Once that's done, we then, sorry, I was just looking really blurry from standing back here. Once that's done, we then want to make sure that it has permission. I always forget this step. Under settings, actions, workflow permissions, we need to make sure that we give the GitHub action permission to read and write our repository so that it's able to go through and make changes to issues and PRs, in this case, to add comments. So we want to make sure it's got read and write permissions. Once this step is complete, we run the workflow again, and this time we have a comment added to our PR. It lets me know that the build works, and I can view the deploy preview here. And if you don't believe me, you can still find that specific deploy preview live on the internet. There's a live URL that anybody can access. Okay, that's the shortened version of the URL, but it will take you to the really long randomly generated deploy URL. We talked about how this build step is specific to Netlify because that's where I'm hosting my website, but you can deploy wherever you like. For example, we've just built on Netlify. I could also use the Azure Static Web Apps GitHub action function to deploy my website there. So I can build and deploy on Azure and give it an ID and use the Azure package, pass in the Azure token to deploy to Azure, and it also needs my GitHub token so that it can also create a comment on the repo and then pass in some information about the build, and it will then go through and run. And now not only am I deploying to Netlify, I can also at the same time deploy the website to Azure. So I can deploy to wherever I want to. It's just a bit of a different build step. Now that we have a live website that we can test, we then want to go through and set up some tests. So we've previously set up the build job. Now our jobs again have a unique name. So as well as the build job, I also want to set up a job to test. Now you can do this your own specific way. Sometimes you might have a separate workflow file for testing. Sometimes it might be all in one. I have a separate job inside the same workflow. Like the build job, I then go through and define what platform I'm running it on. And on the build job, I want to go through and set an output. So the deploy URL that we got, I want to make sure I output that from that job so I can reference it later on. Because this, as I said previously, jobs will run at the same time, but because we need to make sure it's built before we can test, I can set the build job as a dependency so that test won't run unless build has already finished and worked. I then can go through and define my testing steps. As test is its own complete separate environment, my first one is going to be to check out the repo code so that I have my code to work with again. First testing step I'm going to go through is run Lighthouse. Now, Lighthouse is a testing tool that tests against a whole bunch of things: performance, accessibility, SEO, does a whole bunch of things. I don't often use it for websites, but it's super easy to integrate on GitHub Actions. So we're going to have a look at that now. There is an existing package that we can use, which makes it easy to integrate with GitHub Actions. So I'm going to go through and use that package. I then want to pass in some extra information. So I want to let it know that I want to upload the results later, which we'll look at in a second. And then I want to pass in the URLs that I'm going to test against, which in this case is the deploy URL that we looked at previously. Now, this should be all we have to do. However, GitHub Actions is super duper smart and likes to make sure that we're not accidentally publishing or leaking secrets out. Anybody accidentally committed an API key or an authentication token to GitHub or gotten an error about it? Really? I swear, I've done it in a live demo and had it break, so I promise I will not judge you if you have. So GitHub Actions actually goes through and checks everything that you're putting out in the logs in GitHub Actions and anything you're saving as an output to use elsewhere, it checks to make sure whether or not it's a secret or should be a secret. While this is an incredibly useful feature, it is really sensitive about how it does it. So a lot of these tools, when you deploy a preview version of your website, has a randomly generated string attached to it to make sure that the URL is unique. I think these strings look a little bit like authentication tokens, or they would have deploy IDs which look like secret things, which means it likes to flag deploy URLs as secrets. And it does it really quietly. If you have a look, like right at the very end, just in these little logs, that is not even a failure, it's just a warning. It will just say silently, we've skipped the output of deploy URL because it might contain a secret. Now, I don't know how many hours I have spent trying to work out why my thing wasn't passed. I can't work out where it's disappeared. And according to all of the GitHub issues and discussions and Stack Overflow posts and long ranty blog posts, I'm not remotely the only person. So what we have to do is we have to watch out for things like this. And in my case, I ran into this again because I'd forgotten about it. And the deploy URL will not get passed from the build job to the test job because GitHub says that might be secret. So instead, so where we've gone through and set the Netlify URL and we've passed it out to the output, this is the bit that it thinks is secret. We also want to go through and we're going to base 64 encode a URL twice, just in case. We're going to go through and base 64 encode the URL so that we can then save that as an output that doesn't look like a secret. So this is in the Netlify deploy script. When we get this, we want to go through and base 64 encode this, and we're going to save that as an encoded URL. Then, in our test step, we can then go through and add a step to decode the URL. And this step needs to have an ID because we need to refer to this value later on. And we can then go through and decode a base 64 encoded URL and save that to a deploy URL, which we can then double check, make sure that it is in fact spitting out what we expect. So once we've gone through and decoded the URL, we now have a live URL to feed in to the Lighthouse tests. So we can go through and feed it, in this case, not referring to the one from the build step, but from the previous decode URL step. We're going to get the output and get the deploy URL from there. We can then go through and run. And after our Lighthouse action test has run, we can then go through and see everything has passed, and it has also added an artifact to our GitHub action. So if we have a look at Lighthouse, we gave it a config option of upload artifacts is true. By default, Lighthouse will go through and it will generate a nice little HTML report for us. It lets us know what passed, what didn't, what recommendations it has to make, that whole thing. This will then upload it to the GitHub action, and we're then able to go through and download that report and read it. Now, a lot of the time we might want the data in a different format. You might want it to go through in JSON and we might want to keep track of it. But these HTML reports are super useful for a whole lot of other people on the team. For example, I've worked on projects where these reports are actually really great for the design team to go through, and they can have a look at how things were working, and they can download that without having to delve too much into the code. Next, I want to go through and add some Playwright tests. So Playwright, if you aren't familiar with it, is an end-to-end or UI testing tool. It is made by Microsoft. It's been around for quite a few years now, I think. So it is similar to tools like Cypress or Selenium. And from my experience, significantly easier to use and also takes way less time to install. Anybody tried to install Cypress? It takes like half an hour. It'll silently fail and you got to restart it. So we're going to use Playwright in this case. I'm going to start off, I have to go through and install a bunch of things to get Playwright to work. So I need to install my node modules because that's where all the Playwright testing stuff is. And I also need to install Playwright's browsers so that I can use them. But then I can go through and run the Playwright tests. So I'm going to use that using the Playwright CLI tool. It has previously had a GitHub action to integrate with it, but they've recommended using the CLI tool because it's really easy to run them as a GitHub action rather than having to maintain a separate package. In this case, I also want to pass in my deploy URL as a base URL so I can refer to that in the tests. Next, I also want to upload my Playwright report, and in this case, I have to do it manually. So I'm going to use the upload artifact package, and in this case, I'm also going to check. I'm going to have a check for always. By default, if a step has failed, the next step generally doesn't run. So if the test fails, it's not going to continue on. But if the test has failed, I still want my report. I want to actually see what's failed. So I'm going to make sure this always runs, whether it passes or fails. I always want it to upload the report. And I'm then going to get it to upload the Playwright report, which is in the Playwright report folder. And I want that to keep it around for about 30 days. I want to be able to look back on it afterwards, but we don't need all of these reports continuing to clutter up our repo, so it can delete it at some point. Once I've gone through and run it, again, all of my tests have passed because tests always pass on the first go, right? And then it then have a really nice HTML report it's given me, and I'm able to go through and have a look at that later on, which tells me that all of my tests have passed. I now have, I read there's probably a whole bunch of other tests that I want to go through and do, but we don't need to go through and write all of the tests today. I now have a pretty decent testing workflow. I'm fairly happy with this, and now I know that my code is being checked before my PR is merged. So I can go through and feel comfortable merging my PR in because I know that the tests have gone through and run. However, I need to know what's going to happen after the code is merged in though. So the next thing I'm going to do is I can actually then set up GitHub Actions to deploy a live version of my website. So I'm going to set up a new Actions workflow. This one is going to be build and publish. In this case, I don't want to trigger this on pull request. I want to trigger this anytime code comes to production. So push will trigger anytime code comes to production, whether it's manually pushed to production or whether it's a pull request merging in. Next, I want to go through and I just want to have one job associated with this, which is going to be to build. And I'm again setting up my environment and my steps. The steps for this, same as usual, we've got to check out the repo code, we've got to set up Node, we've got to install the Node modules, and then I'm going to go through and run the deploy to Netlify script. Passing in the environment variables so that I can do that, and then running my script. Now, in this case, I want to do it a little bit differently because I'm not setting up a deploy preview. I actually want to deploy to the production environment. And so this time I'm going to pass in a flag for P for production. Whoops. So I'm going to pass in a flag to my script, and I'm going to go through, and if I quickly have a look at my Netlify deploy script, previously I had the command and then I saved the output of running the command. This time I'm going to check, is there a P flag? Is there a production flag? I want to get the flag, save it in a variable, then check if production is true. I want to append the Netlify production flag to the end of the Netlify deploy command. And then again, go through and save the output of that command. Once that's done, I can then go through and have a look, and I now have two workflows in GitHub Actions. I have my build and test and build and publish. And these will then go through and run depending on whether or not I'm submitting a pull request or whether I've actually put code in production. Lastly though, I want to add one extra little funky feature. So anybody here like to add comments to yourself for things you got to fix later? Actually got some hands that time. Cool. Yes, I like to add a whole bunch of comments to things that I'm absolutely going to remember and therefore would fix later, except I'm not. I know myself, I'm not going to do it. However, we're all developers. We've established we all do this. And there is a really useful actions package. So right before I deploy to Netlify, I'm going to run the to-do to issue action package, which is where it will then go through and search for all of my comments that are appended with to-do, and it will create an issue for all of them in the repo so that I can't forget that I was going to go through and fix those things. I can pass in a little bit of config to this one. In this case, I want to pass in auto assign. So whoever makes the code change that added the comment gets assigned the issue. You did the thing that you were going to fix, you can fix the issue. And lastly, I also then want to go through and close the issues. So if I make a change and remove the reminder to myself, go through and close the issue so I don't have to do that manually. So if, for example, I put a note in my code to, I'm going to fix that command, I'm going to get that command to work again, I can then go through, and when I push that code to production, it is going to then create an issue for me to fix that thing. So I can have a few more reminders of all the things I said I was going to do that I forgot about. And then we said, yeah, so it's got a whole bunch of config that you can do depending on what your preferences are. But as I said, I've got auto assign, so that'll assign it to myself, and then close it if I remove the code. So we now have two workflows, and we can go through, run tests against our code, and then when we're comfortable that it's ready, we can deploy and publish it to production. So we can build and preview our website from anywhere. That's done. We can test a live website. It's also done. And then we can build and publish as well. This is all doable using GitHub Actions, which is why it's a tool that I think is pretty cool. And it allows us to have a lot of flexibility to be able to automate a lot of these things that we don't enjoy doing. Now, I was planning to do this as a live coding demo, but then I thought that sitting there and watching Actions workflows running would probably be a little bit boring, hence why we've gone with the screenshots and a few recordings. If you do not believe that this all works, you can find the GitHub repo. It's called front-end testing. I'm going to tweet out I will share on the various social media platforms, to find a platform of your choosing, the links afterwards. You can find both of the actions workflows functioning there, as well as the tests that we set up. So you can go through and have a look at them on there. I also have a blog post, which is front-end testing with GitHub Actions, which goes through a lot of the stuff that we've written today. And as I said earlier on, if you want to delve a little bit more into what it is that I'm talking about when I say front-end testing, I have a talk from a few years ago. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I think we have some time if anybody has any questions. Yep.
Was that all for free? As in, you didn't have to? Yeah, thank you. You know, that whole workflow stuff, was that all for free? Like, were you on the...
Yep. Was that all for free? I'm pretty sure the free plan of GitHub gives you some actions minutes. So I'm pretty sure you can do a little bit for free, unless somebody wants to disagree with me and tell me not. I'm fully happy for you to prove me wrong, but I'm pretty sure the free plan does include a couple of minutes, and I think you can, so even if you didn't want to upgrade, I think you can like just pre-purchase some minutes if you wanted to do that. So I think the free inclusion is not too bad either. It just becomes an issue when you're trying to build a workflow and it's continually failing and you kind of chew through the minutes a little bit there. I think when it does go paid, I think it gets a little bit funny about they bill it, I think I remember here, they bill it in minutes. So I think you have an allocated number of minutes, but if you run the workflow on Windows, it's like 4 minutes for every 1 minute you use, or don't quote me on those numbers. Have a look at the GitHub website for that. But yeah, so that's the one that then gets more expensive. But if you're just running it on Linux, I'm pretty sure there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do really quickly. Yeah.
Hi. How similar is the process to do this, but in like Azure DevOps with pipelines, if you know?
From what I've heard as like side commentary, I've not used Azure DevOps, well, I've not comfortably used Azure DevOps myself. It's generally just been when massively overcomplicated projects fail and I have to look at the thing and then go, what is going on here? From side comments I've had from other people who've regularly used both of them side by side, it does a lot of the same, but GitHub Actions is more fun and better to use. And so I believe it's a little bit easier to use, a little bit, it's come from a more consumer and enterprise, whereas Azure DevOps, again, don't quote me on this. I'm not affiliated with Microsoft or GitHub, so don't quote me on this. Azure DevOps is a bit more the enterprise side of things. I don't know how Azure DevOps is on the community packages side of things, though. I know Actions has so many options of other things that you can use, and then it's super easy to just chuck your own script in there. So on that side of things, I'm not too sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. You did mention earlier that you get billed based on the amount of time you use to run your actions. Now, is there a way to only run at a certain point? Ideally, just before you merge and your pull request has been approved, or has had some reviews? Because
you should be able to. So I just have to. I've got the whole list. So if you look in the documentation, there are a whole bunch of filters you put in there. There's a whole bunch of them about reviews. So you should be able to go through and do that. Otherwise, you may be able to add a manual check step. So it might start to run the job and then you could add a step that goes, has this got one approval. If not, don't do anything else. So you might be able to add that manual step. That way, rather than running the whole thing, you're just running that one step, which might make it a little bit easier. Otherwise, I'm not sure about running packages, but the advantage of running things through custom scripts is you can run a lot of that locally while you're sort of working out what's happening. Which then means it's just each time it runs, you're having to go through and do that.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Come on, our volunteers love getting the extra steps when they've got to race the microphone around the room. It's when someone over here does it and then someone at the back. I have a question next. If anybody does have any other questions, I will be around for the rest of the conference, so please feel free to come and ask me a question later. As I said as well, there's quite a few of the GitHub team getting around here, and I've been told there's someone from the GitHub Actions team here this week as well, so they may be able to answer some more questions for you as well. I think I've lost my slide. I made it seem like I was finished, and so they've taken my slides off. So maybe if I can get some attention, I might get my slide back up. You put the cards in for the feedback out there, but if anybody had any other feedback, I have a form that I would love to hear from you all about if you had any other questions, or if there's anything in particular you were hoping to hear about that I missed in this session today. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. You can go and have first dibs on the food outside, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.